I want to start by telling you the truth about decision making. And the truth kind of goes like this. As human beings, you're defined by your skeletons, your cells, your tissues, and your organs, just like Dr. Curry was talking about earlier with his dinosaurs. But as people, you're defined by the decisions that you make and the decisions that you don't make. I teach decision making at the University of Calgary elsewhere, and I like to teach using metaphors. And one of the metaphors I like to use is of the bigger picture, seeing the bigger picture. And I like to show this slide to my students. Hope you enjoy it too. And the question I would ask you is, how many dolphins do you see? And there are 9. That didn't appear, but there are 9 in there. There are arrows that would point to 9 dolphins. You can sort of see them around the bodies. You can see them in the middle part of the woman there. And you can see them all around. And I like this slide because it kind of says that when it comes to decision making, we don't see the big picture either. And one of the things that we don't see when we talk about decision making is really important, and that is our values. Our values are largely hidden from us when we make the choices that impact us and that impact the others that are around us. In many ways, you can think of decision making as a mirror that reflects your values to other people. That's one way to look at it. You make choices, you don't think about your values, but there are implied values that you reflect out to the world around you. Another way to think about decision making, and the way that I prefer to think about it, is that decision making is a lens that takes your values, that sharpens them, that brings them into focus, and that makes them materialize in the choices that you make. To illustrate this, we've done some research. One of the examples I'll show you is relevant to, I think, a lot of Calgarians, and that is around the question of ethical oil. My good friend Ezra Levant, who likes to criticize me from time to time. This is my way of kind of getting back at him. We designed an experiment where people could pull up to a hypothetical gas station, much like you would pull up to a bar. And in that bar, just like you could pick beers from different nations around the world made of different ingredients and at different prices, you could pull up to gas pumps and get your gas from different oils from different places in the world, made in different ways. And that the menu would look kind of like something like this, that you could look at the environmental impacts of the extraction of that oil that made that gas. You could look at the overall environmental protection, the reputation of the country that made that gas. You could look at the reputation of that country on human rights. You could look at the greenhouse gas emissions of making that gas from when you pulled it out of the ground to when you burned it in the car, and you could look how much that gas actually cost you. And if you ask Canadians, and we asked a lot of Canadians to pull up to this gas station, which pump would they pull up to first? The vast majority of Canadians pull up to the Canadian pump, the pump that makes oil or that produces gas or that gives you gas from the oil sands right here in Alberta. If, on the other hand, we ask those same Canadians to pause for a second and reflect on the things that matter to them, their values, and to account for those values in their decision-making, we see something like this. All of a sudden, Canada's reputation doesn't matter nearly as much, although it does matter a lot. What ends up mattering a whole lot more is what's happening today, right now. What are we doing in this country right now today in terms of the environment? What are we doing right now in this country today in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and what we're doing to the climate? And when you get people to account for those values first and then go to the gas station, something happens. Canadian gas suddenly falls to 4th place. In fact, in some of our experiments, it falls all the way down to 5th place. And this raises an important sort of point, and that point is that this doesn't mean that Canadian gas is an ethical gas. It just means that there are other things out there that do a better job of reflecting our values. And we want to account for that in the decisions that we make because, like I said, decisions are important. They define who you are as a person. If we ask people, Canadians, Americans, Europeans, people in Asia, which model of decision-making they prefer, most people would tell us that they would rather use the lens model. They would rather pause, reflect, think about their values, use the lens to focus those, and then use their decisions to manifest those values into real-life outcomes. But if you buy the idea that for most of the decisions we make, we're looking at mirrors, and if you buy the idea that we fail to see the bigger picture all the time, then we have to account for another truth in decision-making. And this truth comes from my good friend Robin Gregory and another good friend Paul Slovic. And that truth is that when it comes to the vast majority of decisions that you make in your life, you're not simply an archaeologist uncovering your preferences in the mind, uncovering pre-existing decisions that you've made in the past or pre-existing preferences that you have in the future. Because you can't have pre-existing preferences if you haven't thought carefully about your values to begin with. What you are instead in decision-making is an architect. You're an architect who has to use the information that's present at the time of the decision point, the information that you bring to the table in terms of your values, and then construct a decision, the best decision that you construct at that moment, at that time, the decision that reflects your values. Any good architect will tell you that in order to do good construction, you need a building code. And the building code for decision-making looks like this. We need to first think about what our goals, what our objectives are as a function of the values that we hold. We need to think about the options that we have to choose among. We need to think about the outcomes and the consequences of those alternatives in terms of the values that we bring to the table in the beginning. And we need to think carefully about the trade-offs that we're willing to make when we make decisions and the trade-offs that we're unwilling to make when we make decisions. Ultimately, decision-making is about trade-offs. Now, Raheem mentioned something, and it's true. I do a lot of work for government. I do a lot of work for industry. And in that work, we use a lot of fancy computer simulations and models to get people to think more carefully about their values and then to input those values into big decisions. And I'm not going to talk to you about that today because it implies that decision-making is really complicated and hard, and to some extent that it is. But there's something about decision-making that's sort of natural, something that we can all do. So the example I'm going to show you is an example from East Africa, some work we did in Tanzania in tiny, tiny Maasai villages over about 3 hours. And that decision was around helping people to make better choices about the water treatment systems that they would use in their homes to prevent themselves from becoming very ill. And this is a photo of a young boy at something called the Dip. It's about 800 meters from a small town we worked in. And you can see him dipping a cup into this very brown, kind of chocolate, milky green colored water, and he's about to take a drink. If you look behind the little boy to the left, you'll see some laundry hanging. If you look behind the little boy to the right, you'll see some people getting ready to do some laundry. If you looked off camera to the right, you'd see some people taking a bath. And if you came back dead in the evening, you'd see some animals in the water too. So let me assure you that this is water that you wouldn't want to drink on a regular basis if you had a choice in the matter. So the question is, what can we do in terms of the point-of-use water treatment systems these people use to help them actually make better choices, culturally relevant choices, choices in line with their values that would help them to actually stay safe and live fruitful lives? The conversation started not with words, because this was in a community that was accustomed to dealing with Western researchers and Western analysts on issues like this. So the conversation began with pictures instead. And what you're looking at are 8 pictures drawn by Maasai people in these tiny villages in which we worked. At this time, we worked in actually quite a few villages at the time, to tell you the truth. The top left is a picture of a family that's happy and healthy because they're drinking safe water. The picture to the right of the family is a paintbrush, reflecting the fact that the water has to be the right color. To the right of that is a flower, reflecting the fact that the water has to be of the right smell, the smell that's most in line with people's values. To the right of that is a piece of candy to recognize that the water has to taste just right. The lower left, a watch. You have to be able to get the water that's clean and safe in a timely fashion. To the right of that, a bucket. It has to be as easy as just sort of getting a big volume of water in a single bucket without a lot of thought. Same with the pot, being able to just sort of pour water into a pot, put the lid on it, and cook. And to the right of that, that funny-looking thing on the right that sort of looks like a saddle, that's a cashew nut. And in a lot of these villages, there aren't a lot of Tanzanian shillings to go around, so people would go out into the environment, harvest cashew nuts, take them to market, and trade those cashew nuts for whatever they needed, water treatment systems if you wanted in this case. And the question here is, how many cashew nuts would it cost them to get the different water treatment systems that might help in terms of promoting their health? There are a whole bunch of options people could look at, from really simple ones on the top left, a few drops of chlorine, to simply taking water, putting it in a Coke bottle, putting it on a roof in bright sunlight for 24 hours and letting the UV take over, boiling the water, ceramic filters made locally, to this really cool thing made by Procter & Gamble that you would take a little powder, put it in the brown water on the left, stir it for 15 minutes, and create crystal clear, safe water on the right. The methods that we used really focused on getting people to think about how these different systems would align with their values. And they got to do that by actually trying out all the different systems and then going to the trouble of aligning the alternatives with their values. How well did each of those systems perform in terms of color, taste, odor, safety, and so on. What people actually chose isn't as relevant as the fact that they chose water treatment systems that really reflected what they cared about most deeply in their communities. It's something that we can all do. It's something that we can all learn from some really, really beautiful people. You might be asking yourself at this point, I make a lot of decisions in every day, and you're right. How much of this is too much? If we're going to do this building code thing, how much do we need to do? Well, I got good news and bad news on that front. In terms of all the decisions that you make in your day, and we've studied a whole bunch of different kinds, the best we find is that you're about 50% calibrated with your values for most of the decisions you make. That is to say that with the vast majority of decisions you make in a day, you're only hitting 50% of your values with each of those decisions, and that declines sharply as the decisions become more complicated. So one answer to the question is we need to be using our building code for all kinds of decisions, all of our decisions, if we will. The downside to that is that we make thousands of decisions every day, and if we stop to think about each one of those choices very carefully, it would take us an awful lot of time. So there's another trade-off I want you to think about, and that's the trade-off between something we call accuracy and effort. If you can think to yourself that this decision, I've got to get it right, it requires a high degree of accuracy, then it probably requires a high degree of effort, and you should apply the building code. If you're talking about the decisions that you can get wrong and still live through your day, the decisions that you can get wrong and make right tomorrow, those don't require the building code. You can sort of learn by muddling through, and I encourage you to do that because life is short and it should be fun, and sometimes you have as much fun making mistakes as you do having big successes. So think about effort and accuracy. There's something else I want you to think about, and that is there's no such thing as a free lunch. As you go into decision making like this, and as you start to think about your values, and as you start to apply the building code, and as you start to think about how your different alternatives align with what you really care about, something really interesting happens. As you make choices in that environment, you begin to question them more. So the person that doesn't think too much about their values and blindly goes through their day making decisions is a pretty happy person because they don't really think too much about the consequences of those choices because they didn't stop to think in advance about the consequences of those choices. As you begin to think about those consequences and you make your choices, now you've got a reference point to look back on, and now that reference point can be used in doubt. Did I make the right choice? Would I have been happier if I chose something else? Would I have achieved a better outcome if I had chosen something else? And that too is entirely natural. It's part of the human condition. And you shouldn't look at a building code for decision making as something that's making your life miserable. So what we want to do with the building code is we want to add an additional step. And that step looks at decision making in a new way. Most of you out there, and certainly me, often think about decision making as something that we do once. We have a problem, we're faced with an opportunity, we need to make a decision, we make it, we wipe our hands and move on. Let me tell you another truth. Decision making is something you do over your lifetime. Even a decision you make today about which cell phone to buy or which car to drive or which clothes to wear is something that you can learn from through time. So decision making should be thought of as something that's a lifetime activity, an organic activity that evolves just as you evolve over time. So we want to add a step to our building code, and that is after you've made a choice, monitor that decision. How do you monitor that decision? You recalibrate yourself. You look at your decision that you just made, and you think about to what extent does that decision, now that it's unfolding for me in my real life, address the values that I articulated at the beginning. Is it doing a good job? I'll stick with it. Is it doing a poor job? I might change my decision. Are my values changing? Well, I sure better change my decision now. So monitor that decision, learn about outcomes, learn about yourself, and adapt through time. So I've said a lot. Is there an upside to all of this? I think that there is. I think there's a pretty big upside. And I'm going to go back to what I said at the very beginning. You are defined by the decisions that you make. The decisions that you make project the values that you hold to the world around you. So I think it's incumbent upon you, it's certainly incumbent upon me, to take the time to think about what my values are, to think about how those values affect the choices that I'm about to make, and what those choices are going to mean for the people around me. I think we all want to be the best people that we can be, and to be the best person that we can be, we've got to start thinking carefully about what our values are. But there's something else. As you begin to make choices that are in line with your values, you begin to reflect not only your choices to others, but your values to others. Those others are your family members, they're your friends, and maybe most of all, they're our leaders. I think right now we go out into the world and we make a decision every 4 or 5 years about who we're going to choose to lead us in the world, and that's a decision that we make. We sort of wipe our hands and move on and forget about it. But the reality is you can take every decision you make in every day of your life, use that to project your values to those around you, to the leaders above you, to hold them accountable to what matters to you, to what matters to your community, to what matters to your family. I think that's important. So that's the truth. The truth is your decisions matter. The truth is that your values matter, and the truth is until you begin to line those two things up, I don't think we're going to be making our world a much better place for a long time. But on a positive note, little incremental changes, little building codes can help us a whole lot, and I encourage you to try it tonight on your way home, and tomorrow, and the day after that. Thank you.